Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time. I hope that you've jumped on online okay, and welcome to today's session. It's a really exciting one. It's entitled Achieving the SAP Intelligent Enterprise Cloud Best Practices. Now, if you have been exposed to IT teams over the last couple of years, you'll be aware that this is a burgeoning challenge that's facing a lot of enterprises. So, really looking forward to sort of adding a little bit of meat on the bone to that talk track, and hopefully just giving you some good ideas around sort of how you can develop a blueprint in this transition to cloud. And connect you with some of the technology leaders in this space. So this session is actually held on behalf of Souza and Dell Technologies, and really looking forward to sort of having them share their thought leadership on this, and getting you involved as much as possible, as we always like to do. So the first thing is, from a technical side of things, if you can see and hear me, 98% of your tech issues are probably all done and dusted, which is great. If you do have any issues throughout the session, though, the best thing to do is refresh your browser. Secondary to that, we've got a best question prize today, which is a masterclass giveaway. Now, I know that throughout region, there are a lot of cities and towns in lockdown. So this is a really good best question prize, which I'd love for you to stress out all the presenters at the end. So keep them curly, and you can pop them in the chat. So Simon's just popped a little hello. I'll pop a little hello in there too. Feel free to jump in and say hello and maybe where you're logging in from. And you can also pop them in the Q&A section as well. So I'd encourage you to do that. Before I introduce the speakers, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional landowners of where this session's actually being produced. So I'm in the pretty beautiful Sydney today. So the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any elders or emerging leaders from other country that might be online with us today. So as I said, it's just great to sort of get some really good thought leadership on this subject matter, because it is something that's sort of been sitting within the enterprise, as I said, for some time, and people are at different stages of their journey. That's one observation I've sort of found from talking with CIOs. So we'll be kicking off with Sally Kingston. Sally's the solution engineer for S4HANA Digital Core ERP from SAP. And then we've got a really cool talk track with Michael Buckfast. So he's the engineer and technical evangelist for Souza in ANZ, and he's joined by Rob McLaughlin, who's the principal systems engineer and SAP specialist for Dell. And they'll be talking through a little bit about sort of how to get this going. And a big thanks to Rob. We actually recorded this a little bit earlier because Rob's in New York, so I think it's about 3 a.m. there. And then after that session, we'll bring it all together and hopefully get a nice robust Q&A going and get all your questions answered. So without further ado, I might actually ask Sally to jump on and kick us off.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. Can you see me and hear me clearly? Just to
certainly can.
check the IT setup today. Excellent. Look, it is such a pleasure to be able to present today. And it's always a pleasure to be able to talk about SAP's notion of the intelligent enterprise. So I guess without further ado, and with your permission, often when you mention the intelligent enterprise to people, they kind of react in really interesting ways, right? Some have these apocalyptic visions of artificial intelligence sweeping the workplace, taking millions of jobs with it in the process, and others kind of look up from their, Siri-enabled smartphones just long enough to tell you how machines are going to take over the world. Well, I think, in my opinion, the reality couldn't be more different, and the intelligent enterprises that SAP deal with every day are really using our technology to fundamentally change the way that they work and really unleashing a tremendous amount of value in the process. So imagine, having your own personal artificial intelligence to help you do things better. Imagine having all of those menial tasks and mundane processes taken care of automatically, really allowing you to focus on more important things. Imagine having a genius assistant that never sleeps, never takes a sickie, never even needs a lunch break. And essentially, this is exactly what SAP is doing with the Intelligent Enterprise. We're delivering that next generation of intelligent business processes. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? Well, SAP has a really long history of leveraging the latest technology innovations, from mainframe with SAP R2 back in 1972, and then 20 years later, embracing, making that giant leap to client-server architecture with SAP R3. We then embraced the World Wide Web with mysap.com. And then in 2011, we had this 100% in-memory analytical and transactional computing with our SAP HANA database. And what that actually gave us was the ability to manipulate truly massive amounts of data at lightning speed, which meant we could do what we've already been doing, but faster. Then, I guess, suddenly, we then entered into this, environment of buzzword mania, with all of these digital enablers, these intelligent technologies, with IoT and AI and blockchain, machine learning, big data, predictive analytics, robotics, process automation, and the list goes on. But what we actually found was a lot of our customers were really struggling, and they didn't really understand the difference between adopting these technologies versus absorbing these technologies. Organizations had teams doing IoT stuff and some teams working on, blockchain projects, sometimes hundreds of these projects working in parallel, trying to actually adopt these digital enablers, which weren't actually adding a lot of value because they weren't genuinely implemented in a very, or they were generally implemented in a very disorganized, disjointed and fragmented way. So meanwhile, behind the scenes, SAP, well before the global pandemic, SAP began working on a new pragmatic application in a business context to actually allow our customers to actually absorb, adapt and develop on these technologies into things that actually makes a difference to their organisation. But in order to do this, we actually needed to look at the very foundations of an organisation. At the most elemental level, organisations strive to manage three fundamental areas. These are people, your processes, and your data. By people, we mean customers, which can be the community. Obviously, no one would have, a business or organisation without them, but also your employees, which are every organisation's most valuable asset. And then you've got your partners, because no organisation's an island. We need our suppliers, our service providers, our trusted advisors. And then we have our processes, and our processes are the arteries and veins that allow organisations to function. And SAP has been doing business processes for nearly 50 years. So today, processes are often complex and far-reaching, and they often extend well beyond the walls of your organisation to include many parties in a very collaborative and very symbiotic manner. And then, of course, you've got data. Now, the nature and the meaning and the opportunity of data today has changed significantly. And I'm going to come back to the data piece in a moment. But if we talk about in the people area, we often, or you will hear people talking about the discipline of experience management. We understand how critical it is to constantly measure the pulse of experience and to react and adapt and ensure that we attract and retain and delight, and increasingly, within this increasingly competitive world. So you may hear us talk about X, or experience data, or experience management, or XM, and that's exactly what we mean there. And then on the other side of that, we've got operational efficiency. And essentially, this has been the panacea for organisations seemingly forever, right? Using systems like SAP to squeeze every ounce of efficiency and every last dollar from their processes. So here you might hear us talk about O or operational data. And then finally, we come to the data pillar. Now, this is where things have exploded. Organisations today are really drowning in data, yet starving for insight. And they're really struggling to figure out what it all means and what to do with it. In fact, you know, in the last 2 years alone, 90% of all of the data in the world was created. We generate a boggling 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. And I looked that up, and that's a lot of zeros. So when we talk about the intelligent enterprise, we actually needed a way to seamlessly orchestrate and integrate these fundamental pillars of an organization. And this is where the business intelligence comes into it. This is where we've put, we've put the intelligence into the intelligent enterprise, where we've placed, business intelligence at the center. And what that's allowed us to do is to read truly massive amounts of data, then to interpret that data and to derive some real meaning and insight, and then to act on that data, to make predictions, to provide recommendations, to even act in ways that we couldn't imagine before. So, when we think about that, if we think of COVID-19, and it's very hard not to talk about the pandemic, because what it's actually showed us, it's showed us what digital transformation and disruption really means. It's actually given us a glimpse into a future where being able to turn your business 180 degrees overnight is actually essential. A world in which digital channels become the primary and in some cases the sole engagement model. A world where automated processes are the primary, driver of productivity, and the basis of flexible, transparent and stable supply chains. A world in which sort of agile ways of working are a prerequisite to actually meeting, seamlessly daily changes to, customer behaviour that we're seeing as well. So I guess the reality is business models are changing and your traditional processes just aren't good enough today. So organisations are transforming in order to stay ahead of the curve and actually become and remain relevant in order to meet ever-increasing customer expectations, market regulatory demands. So this rapid transformation is placing a lot of pressure on existing key processes, business processes, and to support this change, you need an intelligent and an integrated business process with insight and with total visibility across your entire organisation. So if we look at some of the technologies that's enabling this, such as smart vehicles or connected fleet management and mobility as a service, they're all technologies that are accelerating, this transformation that we're seeing today. But I guess the crux of that is, so what's different about SAP's next generation ERP solution, S/4HANA? And I guess to gain all of this business agility, in order to be able to pivot and move quickly and support all of these new and emerging and changing scenes that we're seeing today, you actually need the simplification and the standardization that is provided by SAP S/4HANA. And this is all underpinned by S/4HANA's simplified data model. So let me kind of explain what I mean by simplification. When we talk about a simplified data model, it's far more than just being able to process things faster. So I've got an analogy that I like to use to better understand what a simplified data model looks like. So some of you, well, I certainly do, some of you might remember taking pictures and sending them to friends back in the 80s. You recall that it was a complicated process. You recorded the pictures on film, which had to be then processed with chemicals. Then the pictures were printed on paper and then often sent by the postal service, right? And this was a complicated web involving lots of people and lots of steps. And then eventually, this process could be sped up using 1 hour photo processing and overnight delivery. You could actually get a picture to someone in as little as a day. So while this improved speed, that was nice, at the core, the process was still as complicated as it ever was. And then the internet changed everything. Now your camera is like your network node that can transmit a photo to anyone in seconds. But it's not just merely faster, the architecture has been reduced dramatically. The simplified architecture not only improves the speed, but it has allowed us to be far more creative and to do things that we couldn't actually do before. So I guess what this analogy actually illustrates is that speed alone is not sufficient. If you aren't removing these layers from the architecture, you aren't actually simplifying anything, and you're not unleashing all of this creativity and opportunity to actually solve some of the different types of problems that we're seeing today. So in a sense, all other ERP solutions today, including running on ECC, on HANA, are like the old ways of sharing photos. Yeah, it can be made faster in some areas, but only S/4HANA actually takes advantage of the speed and the dramatically simplified architecture. So if I take that to the next level, if we think about taking full advantage of in-memory computing that we have with SAP HANA, SAP S/4HANA has been re-architected with a simpler data model that drastically eliminates all of these unnecessary data redundancies, unlocking a whole lot of new possibilities and for many organizations. So this is an example. This is an example for all of my IT colleagues out there. It's a data model example for inventory management. So if you see on the left-hand side, we see all of the transaction and aggregate cables that were required to run basic inventory management. And most of these tables are aggregates and history tables to provide the subtotals needed for analysis tasks. Now on the right, you can see that it's been simplified into 3 simple objects. How's that possible? Well, the HANA in-memory database is so fast that we can now compute the aggregates on the fly when it's required instead of computing them in advance. So often guessing what users will need and storing them. So that comes with, numerous numbers of benefits from not only a business, but also from an IT perspective. So if we think about the benefits of a simple data model from a business perspective, analytics and transactions are now sourced from one source. So if you look from a finance perspective, all of your finance applications in S/4HANA access the same repository from the single source of truth. So you can actually then accelerate your decisions based on real-time data-driven insights at any point of action. So one of the biggest simplifications in S/4HANA is the universal journal. And what that essentially has eliminated is the need for reconciliation and having to maintain, and it constantly maintains that data consistency. It also enables, this simplified data model enables rapid changes to business models, so you can pivot into new business or new emerging markets and new processes that you might need to adopt really quickly. It enables intelligent technologies such as machine learning and automation because of that single repository. It also enables, functionality or new functionality to emerge across many different lines of business. So the value for finance, for example, is really quite substantial because it provides that data consistency across all of your finance applications. That single financial journal eliminates that reconciliation, as we mentioned. Some of the benefits from a simpler data model from an IT perspective, you've got a much simpler IT landscape, reduced resources, often reduced data and system sizes. It reduces all of the data conflicts and reconciliation that's required, and quite often is easy to back up and restore, for example. So just, in summary to that, of course, to modernise your ERP solution does require an element of planning and preliminary work for you to really sit down and think about the processes that you need to support in the future. So when you're looking to move your ECC environment or any ERP environment to S/4HANA. So with that, I'm then going to hand over to Rob and to Michael, who will dive into some of those steps in the journey of how customers can actually achieve this in a really record time. So thank you, Matthew. I'll hand that back over to you.
Thanks so much for that, Sally. It was great to sort of get that macro view, and you really illustrated digital change so well. And that analogy around the photographs couldn't be too true. I'm not sure which one's more fun, the original way or the digital photos. So on that note, as Sally mentioned, what I'll do now is pass over to Michael and Rob to kickstart this discussion and take this a little bit further.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Matt. Let's get things started. Again, Rob McLaughlin from the Dell Technologies side. When we talk about SAP with our customers, in many cases, we have customers that have been running SAP for a decade or so. And in some cases, we have customers that are entirely greenfield and it's a brand new experience for them. But I'll have to say that in the majority of the cases, our customers have been running, and they are experienced in running SAP for quite a long period of time. When we double click on an SAP landscape, one of the things we find out right out of the gate is there are multiple SAP systems for each component. So within a typical SAP landscape, you'll see ECC, BW, there may be some exposure to HANA, but underneath every one of those components, there's not only a production system, there's also a non-prod system, a dress rehearsal environment, there could be a DR environment, but in reality, what you end up seeing is you see definitely a production host for each SAP component, and then you see multiple non-prod systems that are there for really two things: the promote to production landscape, right? Your ability to push changes throughout the landscape, and also DR and fault tolerance are typical in an environment, right? So out of the gate, your exposure to a ton of environments is out there, right? Also, what we typically see is the infrastructure and the underlying architecture that's out there in support of those SAP systems, in many cases, has been dedicated based on either components or based on non-prod versus production. And it's in many cases a physical infrastructure, right? When we double click and we look at what's sitting underneath, it's typical that, if you look at an environment for ECC, in many cases, it's running at half utilized, right? The memory and the CPU and the processors are running at 30 to 40% utilized. And if we look at the storage layer that's underneath, in many cases, there's capacity that's sitting out there unused, right? And what tends to happen is ECC may have his own stuff, BW may have his own environment, CRM may have his own, and in reality, what ends up happening is ECC may need additional space or performance or memory, but he can't really grab it. He may be exhausted from his perspective, but when he goes and looks towards the other systems, because those systems are isolated in a sense, in many cases, it's stranded assets, right? So you have to go and procure additional hardware, services, or storage resources in order to grow that environment, where in fact, that there's additional resources running over on that other island, but the way that the things have been architected, it really does limit your advantage or your capability of leveraging those resources, right? It's very interesting, right? It's almost like 3 to 4 years ago when customers were architecting SAP, or maybe longer, customers threw hardware at it, right? No matter what, they're like, hey, I don't know how many SAPs I'm going to need. I'm not sure how big my database is going to grow. Let's just throw a bunch of hardware at it. Let's split these environments up so that one system can't interact with the other or can't interfere with the other. So that's a complexity for sure. Also, I mentioned the promote to production path. So that's the process of doing changes throughout your system in order to do releases and go lives and do break fixing. In many cases, that promote to production path is extremely cumbersome. So a basis or the business has a new release that they want to push out. Now they have to do a brand new SAP system copy. They have to create a fresh set of QA systems. That process is entirely difficult and cumbersome. In many cases, it involves not only the basis guy, also the DBA, the systems admin, and the storage admin. So you have all these people calling each other to make sure that they have certain requirements met before they can actually do the bulk of the system copy. And in the end, that bulk of the system copy is usually happening with what I would consider operational based tools like backup and restore tools, right? So it's typical that these processes take days and maybe weeks. And while they're running, while you're backing up and restoring these environments in order to create a fresh copy of QA across your full landscape, your backup infrastructure is entirely overburdened, right? And in many cases, it's impacting your production operational procedure.
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in there, Rob, and to that lovely complexity that you've described. The thing that I see in almost every SAP landscape that has a bit of history is we have, on top of what you've shown here, you have a depth of multiple databases, that have come in over time. Businesses have been acquired, divested, and you might have one system running a different DB, a different version of NetWeaver. And with that comes, if you're doing HA, you've got different versions of clustering, different styles of clustering, and that all it multiplies all that complexity that you've outlined in the infrastructure before.
I totally agree. That's perfect, Mike. Okay, so when we look at these environments, these customers have been managing and maintaining these environments for 5 to 10 years. In many cases, they've established SLAs around RTOs and RPOs and performance that are satisfactory to the business, right? The key thing here is, as customers are looking to transform and modernize their environment, is to keep what's best around what they've been doing around availability, performance, RTO, RPO, consistency for system copies and stuff like that, while at the same time modernizing them in order to meet the business challenges that are up on top, right? So how can I provide increased time to value, while at the same time lower my operational costs? In many cases, that operational cost is all around the manual work that's involved in not only doing stuff like backups and restores, but also in doing stuff like failing over database copies. Just a database copy in many cases requires the basis guy to call the DBA, to call the system admin, to go ahead and call the backup admin. And before long, you have different work efforts that have to be done across each one of those silos. Whereas if we could reduce or drive some agility and automation into that process, we can really streamline a lot of the operational stuff. On the architectural side, we have in many cases, these customers are running disparate infrastructures, right? They may have a different server type for app servers, a big honking Itanium box for the database server. They may be running a bunch of different storage arrays on the back end. It just drives tremendous complexity around patching and maintenance and performance and tuning and different vendor support model. So how can you reduce that complexity moving forward? And also, finally, as part of that move, how can you reduce the risk of moving towards an x86 platform if you haven't really been using it for portions of your environment? And also, how can you reduce the risk of running your SAP environment on HANA or moving to S4 HANA or BW4 HANA? So we take everything, right? The SAP landscapes, the complexity that's involved, the multiple systems that are part of the landscape. And 10 years ago? It's probably about 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
Right? SAP said, you guys have to move to HANA. You have to go to Suite on HANA or you have to go to S4 HANA. So every one of our customers are looking at their full-on landscape and what's their transformational plan going to be to move those SAP components, if they're going to stay on SAP or not, to move them over to either Suite on HANA, S4 HANA, or BW4 HANA, right? One thing I'll mention here is it's almost always a system-by-system approach, right? In many cases, it's not big bang, right? So you may have 5 or 6 production environments. It's typical that a customer takes 1 or 2 and they move it across that promote to production path as part of the migration, right? So they go through sandbox, dev, then QA, and then finally get to production. And this happens over, a 3 to 4, in some cases longer window. But from an infrastructure side, whether you're going to on-prem, hybrid, or full-on hyperscaler, it's important that you look at the entirety of the landscape, right? Not only that one component, how big it's going to be, how big it is day one, and also how big it's going to be over 18 months or 24 months, but also all those other SAP components that are part of your entire landscape, and also a good understanding of what all the interfaces are that are part of your SAP environment. So what are the bolt-ons? What are you doing for EDI-based stuff? What are you doing for front-end stuff? Because the last thing you want to do is decouple your SAP environments and kind of break the connections and the performance or inject egress or ingress type charges by doing that stuff with hyperscaler. So it's important that, number one, understand everything that's part of your landscape, right? All the SAP systems, and also align your sizing, your infrastructure sizing, your infrastructure readiness plan with your full-on SAP transformational roadmap, right? So that's what I'll Michael, you have anything to add there?
Yeah, look, that's all perfectly correct. I mean, understanding those costs when you're going to leverage a hyperscaler for part of your SAP world is absolutely critical. And with the transformation to HANA, particularly from traditional databases, you're going from on-disk to in-memory database. The business is going to get used to things happening faster.
That's right.
So your resource consumption is going to change fundamentally. And you need to look at that over, whatever the right sort of period is. Like sometimes it's a full quarter to get the peaks of
that's right,
periodical reporting understood in terms of what it means for your resource consumption. And it's all part of the journey.
Perfect. So real quick, and we're not going to go into any real infrastructure bits and bytes here, but from our cloud, Dell Technologies cloud model is all built upon Apex, right? So if you look at the very top, it's all everything we enable is to provide a consistent infrastructure, consistent operations, and consistent services. So no matter what you do, we start at the bottom where you have an underlying physical building block, whether it's hyper-converged, converged, or servers with storage on the back end. We're right-sizing that infrastructure building block out of the gate, also allowing you to understand what your scalable building block is going to be. So day one, I need X amount of compute and X amount of memory and X amount of storage, but you also understand what that scalability building block needs to be in support of your SAP transformation. You move up a layer in this blue chart, you can virtualize or not, right? VMware can be part of the picture. The virtualization layer absolutely abstracts all the physical constructs that we're surfacing from the hardware layer, allows you that abstraction layer. So on top, the software layer can go ahead and orchestrate and automate many of the tasks that are happening down at that physical layer, right? So that's really what provides us those three pillars of consistent infrastructure, consistent operations, and consistent services. And up here, what we're really doing right now, we're talking about that SAP core. So that SAP HANA environment, right? This same infrastructure can be leveraged in support of edge-based scenarios as well. And we're going to get a little bit deeper around how this type of hybrid environment could be used with cloud adjacency to drive leveraging services that are available in the public cloud as well. So there's four key pillars that we define. So everything we do when we're defining our infrastructure building block, our SAP design, is based on these four key pillars, right? The first is agility or faster time to value, right? So our goal is we want to deploy SAP in hours, right, as opposed to days, right? The ability to surface an SAP system with a point and click based dashboard, right? As opposed to doing the manual work that's involved that I mentioned before. Provide a self-service based capability to your SAP users. So your business users, when they're doing a release or a go live, they can leverage this self-service capability to actually just go ahead and schedule the workflow that's going to happen and that's going to be orchestrated behind the scenes to build these environments for you on the fly. And also how can you deploy in a hybrid and multi-cloud environment, right? So yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be all in your data center. It can be run in this hybrid world where you're leveraging assets in a colo facility or in a hyperscaler facility, right? On the better service levels, it's all around availability, right? From a infrastructure and virtualization point of view, 3 nines based availability out of the box. When we layer that with the capability that SUSE brings to the table, we can do 5 nines plus capability across every layer of the infrastructure. App servers, central services, ASCS or CI, and also the database layer. Our goal is to inject absolutely 0 single points of failure, and also, as Michael's going to talk about in the few slides, 0 downtime migration. So the ability to do rolling patches and rolling upgrades of your SAP environment. All of our, on the security and risk mitigation side, that third pillar, all of our solutions are SAP validated and certified. They meet all the key performance-based KPIs. And what's super important here is we ensure compliance and your security policies across your full SAP landscape, whether you're running on-prem, hybrid, or this colo/cloud adjacent model. It's our goal to provide and ensure compliance across every layer of that environment. And that fourth pillar is all around reducing TCO. So it's not only around right-sizing the infrastructure, building blocks, but it's also around driving automation and landscape consolidation across the board.
Yeah, Rob, look, I just want to jump in and say,
no problem.
You know, sometimes we call these things by different words, but we're in complete alignment with these kinds of pillars and the goals of doing things this way. One thing I would add, and a word I've heard quite a bit recently, is, you know, with time to value, it's just this notion of resilience. You know, there have been some interesting sort of unusual challenges to business in the last 12, 24 months. And
that's correct.
Yeah, they're not just about, you know, the regular challenges from market competitors, but, you know, it's just stuff about having to change how you do business on a dime for either remote work or for doing things 24/7 that you were previously only allowed to do 9 to 5, you know, and having to do that, you know, immediately. And it belongs under time to value, but it's you know, it's a little more human and emotional than that in the last.
That's an outstanding point. Yep, outstanding point. Cool. So this is all around deployment. Of course, this is on the Dell side, right? Of course, you can deploy your SAP infrastructure entirely on-prem, right? The Apex private cloud model is all around driving automation into that building block. So some of that stuff I talked about before, the ability to create non-prod systems on the fly, automate much of your deployment and scalability tasks. This same model can also be deployed in a hybrid cloud mode that actually runs outside of your data center. And we could provide that capability to go ahead and inject and leverage the hyperscalers for stuff like data protection and non-prod environments as well. So overall, you can see on that far left is probably what in many cases you've been doing with your SAP landscape over time. But as you move over towards that right side, you could see those services can be deployed in a cloud-like world, both on-prem with automation and also in a colo/hyperscaler with a hybrid cloud and leveraging the hyperscalers for some of those like tier 3 level services around backup recovery and non-prod type environments. Right. And then really, you know, on top of these blue building blocks, which is really the Dell-based infrastructure, all the OS platform, we have SUSE as that top layer to provide the OS-based capabilities. And this is where I'm going to throw the ball over to Michael and have him dive a little bit deeper on the SUSE side of things.
Thanks, Rob. So that's a great introduction to exactly where we're at and roughly where we're trying to get to. From a SUSE perspective, let me start at the beginning, which is basically that we're a 25-plus-year-old enterprise Linux company, and what that means is that we started out with a mission of trying to bring some enterprise-like qualities and usability to this little project that was once called Linux. And along that journey, there was another little company called SAP who came along and said, yeah, we'd like to bring our enterprise software to Linux. Would you please help us? And so that happened. And then a little further down the road, someone had the idea that an in-memory database might be something that customers could use to leverage business value. And that, again, needed more enterprise capabilities built into Linux kernel. It needed some supporting things like HA to be thought about in the first place. And this is something that SUSE and SAP have kind of co-developed over the years, over the journey. Running enterprise workloads on Linux is SUSE's core business. We also do a tremendous amount of work in the area of containers and Kubernetes and some of the more recent cloud native development models that are out there. And it's interesting, these two worlds are coming together in a way, because SAP is also beginning to use containers in some of their products, such as SAP Data Intelligence. And that then comes out to, the things that we're doing for gathering data from edge devices and future application architectures that, the word hybrid is going to, I think, disappear in a couple of years, because everyone will be doing it. Therefore, it will be mainstream, because we'll all have devices, we'll all have services that we consume, and we'll all have things that are our own things that we look after and and pet. So that's what we do. Basically cloud native Kubernetes work, SAP work, enterprise Linux. And the big focus that we bring comes through our operating systems that drive customers' SAP landscapes, through the management platform that we layer on top of that, that delivers into the architectures that Rob's been outlining here. So if we can just move to the next slide. Thanks. So really on this slide, what we see is a little bit of the current state, with that history that I've described. SAP SUSE is the platform of choice for SAP landscapes running on Linux. Most of it goes on us in one way, shape or form. We power SAP's own internal and external systems. So it's a nice story to talk about there in terms of their path to high availability that they went through some years ago, and we're their development platform of choice as well. So in terms of what impacts customers, on the left-hand side, we see a great long list of features, none of which I'm going to talk through in detail, but all of which, the point is really someone came to us and said, hey, it will be, there's this cloud thing, hey, how about we put an OS on there and get SAP certified on it? And again, that was something that we did earliest, just as with the high availability piece before that, with the Pacemaker open source project and adapting that to the needs of SAP landscapes. Moving into more recently, things like monitoring, as systems get more complex, having monitoring dashboards that can tell you about your SAP queries and your infrastructure at the same time are kind of, they're not really optional anymore. They're something that you actually need. So there's this journey of, virtuous sort of journey of, customer need, co-development, innovation, that sort of comes with us first. And I think that's the quality that comes out here, is that it's just of doing these things first and longest, which leads to the experiences in terms of deploying them out there. Can we have the next slide, please? So what that means, for example, is with our minor update releases, for example, we don't skip releases and certify every second or third release, which makes that update cycle a lot easier for some customers. We have sort of we've seen the need for automation coming from a long way back, and the speed that cloud, for example, enables means that, hey, I can have more systems, therefore I have a bigger workload. So all of this stuff is creating a wave of pressure that requires automation. Otherwise, you can't possibly keep up.
Yeah, and what's interesting there is I was talking to a customer just last week. It's not only the ability to create these environments quickly and easily and on the fly, it's also the ability to destroy them, right? So, right, Michael, I mean, how many customers do we talk to where they have that production support system that's been sitting out there for, a year, but it hasn't been refreshed because they don't have that automation to actually refresh it and also destroy those environments when they're actually not in use anymore.
Yeah, the whole life cycle of that it's just bigger and faster than it ever was before. When in the next few slides, when I talk about some specific things that we're doing around downtime and day two elements that apply just as much in the on-prem world, but perhaps even more so in the hybrid world. We'll talk through some stories of how some of these things have actually impacted the way customers do things. The net of all this is that we're really the platform of choice for SAP environments, and what I'll do in the next few slides is just talk through some of the specific features that come out of our products that make that happen. So the first great demon that we have to slay in all of these things is unplanned downtime. I talked about bringing HA clustering to the Linux world originally and applying it to SAP. And in the SAP world, that includes what we do around the central services, which is one kind of clustering, and what we do around databases and what we do around HANA. And with all that done, then there's how do we take things out to a DR environment, which in the HANA world is quite different to what we used to do with other databases previously. So the agents that we deliver basically with SLES, SUSE Linux Enterprise Server for SAP applications, we put everything in there that we've sort of learned about SAP. So the HA is there out of the box for you to use. A whole bunch of wizards to get started with installing your SAP are there, and the hooks are there for the automation framework that will enable you to deploy, a complete SAP stack out of our management tool, SUSE Manager, for example. And what customers are doing at this point, really diverges greatly based on the layout of their SAP. In the simplest model, you have SAP Central Services. They're clustered. At the back end, you have HANA databases. They're replicating, which is something that HANA does, and we're controlling that replication from the OS side. If the system fails, the second server comes up. But there are other topologies that are available in that environment where customers can, for example, have that second server get some productive use out of it. They can run their dev, test, QA workloads on there, and then shut those workloads down, bring the HANA up on the second server. Incur a little bit more of a time back to service, but gain a lot more utilization out of the second server. So there's a whole bunch of different topologies and permutations that we can do there. And for all of those different ways, we've done the work to get all those things certified in a HA way. Monitoring of any complicated environment is critical. In the cloud environment, where those environments are now multiplying in number, it's more critical than it ever was. And tracking it back to the infrastructure that it's affecting, correlating, long-running queries with, the traditional compute CPU utilization that you see on a system is being able to do that quickly and conveniently from a graphical dashboard is a godsend to the basis administrators. There's the technology that I've talked about. There's some of these processes that I've talked about, and there's people, right? And what people do is they misconfigure things. They configure things. Now, controlling that, is through automation and configuration control frameworks is part of this picture. Because you deploy something correctly, you want to make sure it stays correct over time. You want to make sure that it's changed the same way every time. And this is something we can do. It's out of the scope of today, but we started this specifically with a view to complex applications like SAP, lockdown configs. But we can do this now across non-SUSE Linux environments as well from a single management console. We can check for patch compliance. We can remedy non-compliance with the push of a button. So hopefully admins can get their weekends and those tiny little backup and maintenance windows that they have, they can reclaim them a little bit. So next slide, please. Then there's, I guess the last mile of availability, which is planned downtime. We've all been through the dreaded, hey, there's a security exploit out there, but our next open maintenance window is 2 months away. Now, what are we going to do? Just cross our fingers? Are we going to have an emergency outage? Who's going to be impacted? This is a pain point that we got from many customers some years ago, And to mitigate that, we introduced a capability called live patching into SUSE Linux and got it certified with SAP because that was, the application that we saw for it initially. What that enables some of our customers to do is to run for up to a year without taking downtime or critical patching. Right? So that is a huge, huge win in a traditional SAP environment. But when you look at a HANA environment where you've got an in-memory database, and if you shut that down, it takes you time for that to warm up and to return to service. Not having to take an outage there is a really, really big win for many customers. So, we see that in use in most of our large SAP customers. And basically, the bigger your HANA landscape, the more important that is because of the impact. There's another cool piece of tech that's come around in the last couple of years that we got on board with, and that Dell's certainly on board with, which is called persistent memory from a HANA point of view. And it's based on little cards that can look like storage but act like memory. And they enable your HANA system to store some of its state in very fast memory, if you like, that persists across reboots or outages. So what that means is you can restore as quickly as possible, effectively, once you at those times when you do have to take some kind of downtime. So once again, just all these different pieces of the solution are there to get to those customer pain points about keeping things up and running.
The persistent memory also allows for a more cost-effective model to deploy your memory in support of that HANA environment, and it allows for a pretty substantial increase in the amount of memory that we can surface from our nodes as well. So really cool as part of that design and part of that initial sizing when we get involved.
Yeah. And again, back to that last mile of the keyboard, the fingers at the keyboard. In the past, it was possible, for example, for operators using SAP utilities, perhaps to take down some component because they wanted to do something to it, and for a cluster framework to think, hey, I've had an outage, let's have a failover, and that was a suboptimal response. And between SAP and SUSE, basically there's an interface now between all these components so that they kind of speak each other's language. And so that an action at an SAP level to a component doesn't trigger some sort of maintenance event in the cluster, that we actually understand what each other are doing there. So, which goes by the very dry name of the SAP Application Server HA interface. But essentially what it means is it prevents some of those finger troubles of the past from impacting systems. And, once again, keeping those patches up to date and being able to do that easily is something that supports your your pathways to production through all your environments. Right. We call it configuration lifecycle management, another one of these dry phrases from the IT industry. But what it really means is that smooth pathway from, define a bunch of systems and say, hey, this is my QA, or this is my dev, this is my test, this is my QA, this is my prod, and here's how the patches are coming in, here's when they'll be applied to one, rolled up to the next, promoted, and getting some automation into that process, which is, again, as Rob said, is one of the biggest, most time-consuming elements. The sooner you patch, the sooner those things are fixed, and that you avoid the downtime for the problems that are fixed. So, unplanned downtime, planned downtime, and on the next slide, really something that's quite recent, which is the monitoring that we build out. So we use open source at everything at SUSE, and Grafana and Prometheus are a couple of open source projects that we took for grabbing stats on the one hand and graphing them in a customizable, accessible way on the other. We applied that to SAP environments and to our infrastructure. So you can see in one place, you can see alerts, you can see some stuff about the infrastructure, you can find out things about long-running queries, and you can do that for NetWeaver and for HANA environments as well. And this is what helps, tie things together, because the first step of avoiding planned and unplanned downtime, from day 2, is really to see things as they're trending before they get a chance to become issues, right? And then you can dive in and start fixing them. So, and this is about, again, trying to catch up to this place that we're all running to at great speed at the moment. So that was a whirlwind tour through Souza, and what the foundations, if you like, or one layer of the foundations of your SAP house.
Very well done.
Is doing.
I mean, that's all part of that blueprint that runs on top of that platform. So it's perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. So I'll just hand back to Rob to talk through some more of this.
Perfect. And I'm not going to drain this slide by any means, but this is on the Dell side is really what we call our infrastructure-based family tree, or the ingredients of an SAP-based solution, right? Again, we're looking to deliver on these key capabilities around performance, availability, security, DR and availability, and in the end, the underlying foundation, the right-sized infrastructure to drive that IaaS-based building block. So whether you go servers connected to a storage array, or you're going with a smaller building block approach with hyperconverged infrastructure, it can all be surfaced as part of your underlying design. Of course, across the board, our Power Protect and data domain-based data protection solutions are there for a consistent base delivery model for backups and restores. Also provides the capability of doing that stuff not only on-prem or in a hybrid world, but also for any of the cloud-based environments that are running out in the hyperscalers, right? And finally, if we put all of this into play, right, for a typical customer, and again, this is a very high-level big animal diagrams, customers have existing SAP systems, multiple SAP components, some physical, some virtual. They're looking to do this transformation. They're looking to move to HANA. We build that foundation. We've right-sized that infrastructure-based building block based on all NVMe-based flash, extreme capability. All the SAPS metrics have been met. All the memory capabilities have been surfaced. Virtualized where it makes sense. Have SUSE as part of the equation. All the day 0, 1, and 2 base capabilities that Michael talked about. That model is deployed. Either you can move your existing environments as is over to that platform, so kind of do a platform-based migration as is. And then once it's over there, you could do brownfield, greenfield, or SLT-based transformations to move over to that S4 HANA or that BW4 HANA world. Or you could go the approach where you take your existing environment and migrate do your SLTs or your brownfield migrations over to S4 HANA. The key that we're showing you here is, right, if we are in front of you and doing a whiteboard-based session, there are obviously different ways we can actually work this out. But once you're on that foundation that provides that continuous-based innovation, the continuous-based deployment models, all that continuous and consistent-based operations, it allows you to really leverage those capabilities as part of your migration, right? Simplify the snapshot of your environment, simplify backups and restores, simplify the creation of those environments, build your HA and DR posture and your clustering capability as part of your blueprint out of the gate, so that as you go towards that HANA world, all of that stuff is just inherited from those environments going forward, right? Finally, I'm showing you, right, in some cases, the leverage of the hyperscalers as well, right? Non-prod environments, backup environments, you name it, can also be extended with this model to the hyperscaler world, right? And if we take like a bottom-up approach, right, to look really deep in the covers, you could see this is kind of each one of those black boxes is a server. I'm showing you a 4-socket server. So each one of those little yellow tabs that are on top is a socket. And we're running virtual machines on top of that. And you could see the BW environment has a HANA system replication synchronous on-prem. And there's also a HANA system replication asynchronous that's running across to that DR side, right? So all of the capabilities are there to provide zero downtime from the HANA database level with clustering capability. And of course, we're providing the capability to do DR with HSR asynchronous over to the DR side as well. Okay. Again, the building blocks can be deployed in a pay-as-you-go, which is the traditional way. Pay-as-you-use, which is a usage-based model where we've right-sized your environment, and as you use the resources in your infrastructure, that's when you start paying, or a pay provided as a service, and that's aligned to your SLAs. So the Dell-based team can manage the entire infrastructure and maintain the environment based on the SLAs that you need to deliver your SAP environment. Right? Both an on-prem and a multi-cloud delivery model can be used in this regard. So how do we get there, right? Really the four key areas. First is all around consolidating and simplifying the SAP landscape. I mentioned it early on, all around the RACI model. Break down the silos that are inherent in some of these teams today. The architects and the basis teams, it's important to have design meetings early and often with your infrastructure teams so that they have a good understanding of what you guys are looking to design towards, and they have a full understanding of what your full-on transformational plan is going to be. As you adopt SAP and HANA, define your SAP HANA transformation roadmap out of the gate, understand the breadth of what you're looking to accomplish. Understand your infrastructure choices, both for traditional SAP, so non-HANA workloads, and also your HANA SAP environments, and also understand what it means to deliver this building block on-prem, off-prem, or hybrid world, right? Understand what the impact is to your SAP landscape, and also your mission-critical apps that are delivered as part of that, not only SAP, but everything else. Running SAP in the cloud operating model, abstracting the physical layer from the underlying platform to provide that command and control and the orchestration, as Michael had talked about. SAP templates, deliver SAP templates and dashboard-based capability to drive that automation. And I think Michael referenced it quite a bit around the intelligent technologies, around the edge-based scenarios, right? Once you've deployed your core and you're running on S/4HANA, that really is when you're going to start being able to sweat that edge-based scenario side and truly define that digital world and how you can do stuff like AI and ML and IoT out in the edge and really expand on your capabilities that SAP can deliver to your business. Okay, thank you so much. From the Dell Technologies side, Rob McLaughlin again, I thank you for your time.
And Michael Bookfair from Souza. Thanks everybody.
All right, perfect. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks so much, guys. We really appreciate you taking us through that. And I think for everybody online, definitely use what the guys walk through as an asset, and feel free to circulate it, particularly if you are embarking on this transformation journey. And as I mentioned, there are people who are at a lot of different stages, and there was some really good content there. I do apologize, like all good conversations, we've gone over time a little bit, but we'll try and just cut through some questions just to finish this off, because a lot of people are still staying online, so we appreciate that. Sally, you had to go at answering this one. I might bring it up. Brian asked, as you're presenting, how is SAP approaching rolling the Intelligent Enterprise out? Is it through projects or whole of enterprise? What advice do you have for sort of executives on sort of where to start, I guess?
Coming off mute would be the first step in that process. Look, essentially, you could break it down into 3 stages or 3 types of transformations. A lot of customers work with or perform a new enterprise core. So they might just look at transforming their existing ECC environment across into a digital core upgrade for S/4HANA first. Then the next stage of that would be to adapt and extend on that enterprise or that enterprise core with, for example, specific industry solutions that might be relevant for your organization, or, for example, not only industry solutions, but you might look at capabilities that extend beyond the core, like HR, or you want to embrace the collaboration network, for example, if you're looking at Ariba as a strategic sourcing requirement that you need. Or you can do a full-blown end-to-end transformation. And that's really that third stage where you're looking to reimagine a lot of your business processes end-to-end. So that design to operate, that procure to pay, or that lead to cash scenario. I apologise for the feedback there. I'm not sure why that's happening already.
That's all good, Sally. Yeah, it's so super critical. You know, particularly to support digital business and digital business models, and the speed that you showed in which the transformations can create is quite remarkable. Aaron put through a question, probably Michael and Kevin. Just a quick note on Kevin. So Kevin O'Reilly, he's head of alliances for APJ at Dell Technologies. So just standing in for Rob, who's probably asleep now. One of the questions was how much of a skill set shift is required to run this transformation based on your experiences. Do you guys have any observations on that?
Well, I'll just jump in from the Souza point of view. In terms of the infrastructure, obviously there is some evolution that goes on. There's also some simplification that goes on. You tend to reduce some of that legacy technical debt that people call it in general. Yeah. So you pick up some new platforms, say in HANA, and you drop off some older databases, for example. So there's an opportunity, to pick up some new skills and to reduce the number of things number of moving parts in terms of those skill areas. So that's one observation I can certainly make.
Kevin, did you have anything to add on that based on your experiences?
Yeah, I think one of the overlooked aspects of shifting to modernizing to S/4HANA is actually the changes in business skills required over the technical skills that are really required. And so one thing that we often oversee, I think, right, Sally, is that organizations may transform technically and shift to S/4HANA without really thinking about what the impact to the business is. And so, yeah, there's a combination of, sure, there's some technical skills, but I think that's a very contained challenge, whereas the modernization and of the business is not tied that directly to the re-platforming of the business onto S/4HANA.
Yeah, that's good. Sally, did you have anything to add on that one? That's quite a...
Oh, look, that's a really apt thing to say, Kevin, because change management is often the most, I guess, underestimated part of this process. It's really a different way of working. You're moving from an SAP GUI interface into something that's really different, and it's a different way of working, and that embracing of change management is really critical, and that's often underestimated. And so bringing the business on board early to actually align and start that change management process is really critical. And we find that customers that do that and often align with those key business users early have the most amount of success. And then they tend to adopt those innovations and those changes a lot more seamlessly and faster, that we're finding.
Yeah, brilliant. And there's just a question here from Chris. Does it support migration to VMware Cloud on AWS? What's the role of sort of the hybrid cloud piece in this transformation? I'm not sure who wants to take that one. Maybe Michael, I can see you.
Well, I was just going to say I can't really speak for the VMware piece of that. I was going to make the comment that about hybrid in general, that I think everybody is going to have a little bit of hybrid cloud, because customers, some customers have to keep control of their own infrastructure for regulatory reasons. Others want to take the advantage of variable costs that you can get from some cloud operating models, and that's the perfect place to engage with Dell to look at your total infrastructure and how that works. That's not answering the technical question; it's answering a broader one. I think perhaps you take that one on notice, the technical side of it.
Well, I think the shift to either public cloud or hybrid cloud, or on keeping something on premise and using a cloud operating model. I mean, ultimately, you're going to end up with a cloud operating model. One of the things we are seeing happening a fair bit these days is that the promise of shifting to public cloud is not, it doesn't always deliver exactly what the customer thinks that they're going to get. So there's a gap between what you think you're going to get and what you actually get. So making that assessment up front, I think, is a really important step, because repatriating something that doesn't work, and we do see that starting to happen, is a really big challenge for businesses. So doing some sort of assessment up front and really delving into the unfortunate details of which model works for you, I think, is a key aspect of assessing how you're going to move forward. And like I said, we are seeing some situations where the promise and the delivery or the expectations haven't been met. So and that then leaves people in a pretty challenging situation to actually fix those sorts of issues.
Yeah, spot on. It really does can compromise, your core mission critical applications. So sage advice to sort of, look at it from the start and do an assessment on your hybrid cloud. Guys, we are going to have to just kick for touch on the discussion. I do love the Q&A. So I'm sure we could deep dive into it for a lot longer, particularly around skill sets and getting that the business buy-in is a critical one too. A really big thanks to everybody for sharing their insights, and Sally for really just adding some wonderful color to the challenge, and then having a look at what transformation really means in 2021. Seems like a gigantic shift again, so from 5 years ago, this conversation. And Kevin and Michael, thanks so much for taking us through the actual process and a little bit around the meat on the bone. I'm sure that everybody's got their minds thinking, and as I said, whatever part of the journey you're on, it's obviously super critical to build up the right IT ecosystem and the right people to sort of make this happen. So alongside business buy-in and having those right conversations, I'd also encourage you all to reach out to the team at Souza and Dell Technologies and see if you can build the right team to really get this going. So a big thanks, and as I said, this will be available on demand, so feel free to shoot it around to the group, and hopefully it can spark up an internal meeting as well and a discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So stay safe and well. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Matt.